And we're live.
Too funny.
Let me see. Is Chloe Flores
here? Hey, Shay, Deidre. Hey, Shamla. And so before we get into like introductions and stuff like that, I thought I would kind of kick off by giving a little framer for, what I was hoping this conversation was going to be about. So if you've been on book Twitter for a little bit, or you've been paying attention to bookish people online, you've probably heard the discussions about Black trauma versus Black joy in books. Readers have generally been calling for more books featuring Black protagonists that are about Black joy or that don't focus on Black trauma. And I think it's generally well understood why books about anti-Black racism, be they fictional, be they nonfiction, are a big presence in the Black book world. But in reading through conversations, I felt like it didn't really map onto my experiences reading sci-fi and fantasy. I think a lot of the conversations I saw were focusing on realistic contemporary or historical fiction set in the United States. And this is the experience we're working from, and there wasn't really a lot of discussion of like, the whys and the hows and all that, and that like disconnect between like what I was reading and how other people are reading really interested in me, and I really did want to get into like the whys and the hows. And so I thought having like a discussion is kind of like really breaking things down with people from a variety of reading backgrounds could really like enrich the current conversation of, how do we define Black trauma? How do we feel about current discussions around it? How does that like conversation show up in the genres that we're reading? So yeah, thank you everyone for joining me. I was hoping everyone could go around introducing themselves, name, pronouns if you want, and where people can find you. I have everyone's links in the description box, but if you want to talk about the platform you're on and what you like to read for people who don't already know about yet. Harley, your right's the next to me, so you can start.
Okay, I'm Harley. I run the Cerebral Hedonist YouTube channel. I'm also an artist and a writer. And the books that I'm interested in, I read just about anything as long as it has some interest to me. So I read very, very broadly. I don't have any singular genre that I read. And I'm happy to be here. I'm very, very inexperienced, so bear with me.
Live.
I know, because I'm like, I've seen her in so many lives now. What is she talking about?
I feel very I'm intimidated right now.
I don't know what the Bookstagrammer is supposed to say about that, but go ahead.
Yeah, I guess.
I think. Oh, Chloe, you were frozen for a bit. Sorry.
Next, whoever's next to me. Wait, this way.
Hi, I'm Bree. I tried to put in my pronouns in my name, but apparently I don't know how to do it anymore. But I use she, her, and her pronouns. I have a channel called Lockbooktition on BookTube, on YouTube here. And I'm also happy to be here and talk about Black trauma. This is one of the topics I'm really passionate about. So I'm definitely ready to get into it.
I'm Jerry. My channel is Onyx Pages, where I niche read. So my area of interest is Black science fiction and fantasy, with a particular interest in Afrofuturism, African futurism, and African Jujuism. And I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I can't wait to get into the conversation. So thank you for the invitation, Chloe.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Akila, better known as Kiki to some on Bookstagram, where I post that If This Is Paradise. I read pretty broadly, but right now I have phases, and right now I'm in a very Caribbean literature phase, primarily literary fiction, I would say, but also science fiction and fantasy from anywhere. I'm currently worshiping Neon Yang right now, so that's my idol of choice. And I'm going into some nonfiction right now, primarily with Caribbean history, queer theory, feminism, speculative fiction, anything like that. So that's me.
Okay, thank you everyone for introducing yourselves. And I thought we can just kind of get into the questions now. So first question is kind of breaking down like what are our definitions? How do you define or understand trauma? What do you consider Black trauma? And how useful do you find that label?
Are we going in order?
You can hop in whenever. I was kind of thinking the discussion would flow a little bit more freely from here, and I'll just kind of show them to like redirect or like bring back around to a question. Appropriate.
Can I nominate? Okay, good.
Harley's a brave one. We're just talking about how we're going to let Bree go first, since she's the practitioner. She's the one with years of experience. But Harley, since you volunteered.
Go ahead, Harley.
Okay, so you'll have to bear with me because I'm having. There we go. I'm having an off day, so I had to write some of my answers to stay on task. Mm-hmm. So, like, the answer I had was originally when I heard the term Black trauma, I understood it as like a generational, genetic, cultural effect of like slavery and identity loss and like basically systemic discrimination. And it's instilled this kind of fear in us that we're subhuman, that we like don't matter. So like everything we are and create can be taken away from us. And that affects how we act, how we view the world, and like how we proceed through life basically and teach others as we go along. We go with the assumption that whether we're excelling or happy, it can all be destroyed. So trauma is kind of the catch-all term for it, and specifically labeling it like Black trauma. It speaks to the exact set of circumstances that created this like this intensity, and it's still affecting us day to day, even as we're climbing out of it. It's even affecting how we're climbing out of it. So that was what I thought about it as. Bree?
God, I gotta remind myself not to be too long-winded. So I'm gonna echo what you're saying. When I think of Black trauma, I think of a collective experience of people throughout the diaspora. And those collective experience can even go even before slavery time or colonialism and to where we are now. I also view Black trauma as an actual change in our DNA that has happened and has been changed from generation to generation. Because when we experience adversity and we experienced it collectively, it gets passed down and passed down and passed down. So a lot of times Black people might feel a discomfort around white people, and it's not even attached to that person, but literally when our ancestors have experienced that trauma and that hurt and that pain, they were not given the opportunity or that space to heal. So it continue repeat itself after generation and generation. And now we are still dealing with those after effects of those different events that happened to us collectively, what's happening currently now in the world. So it's just showing up in our bodies in ways that we just need to heal from. And there's different ways that we can heal from that. But when I look at Black trauma, I look at it as a collective pain that has happened from generation to generation that has been continuously left unchecked.
I agree with everything that's been said by both Harley and Bree. So I'll add something that hasn't been said yet. So as a Black queer woman, my understanding of Black trauma necessarily includes the trauma that's experienced by queer folks within Black communities. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of different theories about whether like the homophobia and transphobia and like compulsory heteronormativity that we experience is like limited to Black communities, or is like an extension of white supremacy and patriarchy and colonization, right? Like there's lots of different ways of seeing it, but for me, Black trauma also includes the specific experiences that Black, queer, and trans folks have, whether it's related to their experiences as members of the Black community that experience oppression within our communities, or as the collective. So it's actually painful for me often as a Black queer person to speak as a Black person without talking about the additional trauma that I experience as a Black queer person within our own communities. So I use Black trauma. I don't actually use Black trauma in my regular life as like as a term, but if you ask me like what I think of, that is what I think of. And it's in contrast, because I think often when it's used, people talk about like the institution of slavery and everything that happened afterwards. But then that would mean that if you're Black or African descended and don't have an ancestral memory of being enslaved, that you would be free from Black trauma. And that's not the experience that we're seeing, right?
Right. So this was an interesting term for me as a Jamaican, as a Caribbean queer woman, where in the region, most of the countries that are seen as Caribbean are Black majority. And we don't really, I would say that I probably see the term Black trauma, even though I think the concept applies to the diaspora. I understand this coming out of like primarily a US context, and that for, not that I can speak for the region and I can't even speak for Jamaica, but like, in my opinion, we don't necessarily, first of all, Jamaica can be kind of conservative. So even the idea that are we traumatized in any way from slavery and colonialism is probably contested. Like, is that even a thing? There are a lot of Pearsons who would say no. And so even in terms of trying to understand the word trauma and then putting Black in front of it, I agree with what everyone said. But when talking about like Caribbean literature and that kind of stuff in our space, it doesn't really come up except for those of us who I think are exposed to more global North conversations, where I think it's far more visible in the media, which doesn't mean like it's any better over there or anything. It just gets discussed more. And I think because of that, I kind of have some mixed feelings about the word, where I think it's very useful and it needs to be discussed, but sometimes I'm not sure about how it's used sometimes, especially, I guess we'll get into it in describing certain books. So that's my take.
Well, here's a question. Since you live in Jamaica, and a lot of the stuff that is part of your culture is through post-colonialism, do you think that a lot of the conservativeness has to do with what you were taught versus
absolutely.
Your ownness? Yeah.
It's completely internalized colonial, in my opinion. Completely internalized, but we don't see it that way because we have a Black majority and a Black government. So there are a lot of things that we take and we say, oh, it's Jamaican. And we don't realize it is actually directly inherited from white British colonialism. But it's been localized enough and it's been obscured enough, deliberately so in my opinion, that we kind of take it on as our own, and I think almost make it ahistorical in a sense. And and we kind of, I think we're in that stage of the trauma, we're still in denial, like severe chronic denial, where it's just like, that doesn't matter anymore. Guys, it's the 21st century and we've been independent for 50 plus years. So clearly we should be okay now. And if we're not okay, it's our fault. And these are concepts that have been instilled and imposed in us, but we don't recognize it as such. And I don't think we want to, because I guess that would make us feel less in control of a lot of things than we want it to be. So it's sort of an interesting concept for me to consider from my position. Even though it's real, it's very real.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh, okay. I was saying like that. It makes sense because, like, mind you, I'm absolutely no expert or anything. My experience with Jamaica is mostly through books. So, like, I was looking into Jamaican authors after I like pretty much discovered Marlon James for myself, and like talking about his experience in Jamaica as a queer man and stuff like that, and how conservative and often religious it is out there, which made him leave in the first place. So I was wondering how much of that was actually like being worked on or anything like that out there, because I know that there's a lot of movements going on during there. I just don't know how successful they are right now, especially with that. And with there being like a lot of Black trauma, a lot of things that come into trauma is a very real level of denial that something happened, and the refusal to be considered a victim of that sort of thing. It's like, hey, it's over now. We've already like moved past it, even though it's never been dealt with. So I wonder if that was possible on like a collective scale like that to just say this is just Jamaican, you know?
I think we're still working through that. I mean, there's definitely a lot of advocacy, and there's a lot of complexity and nuance and difference to life in Jamaica, depending on a number of factors: where you live, your economic and class background, the kind of, even things like the school you went to or where you were, like all of those things come into play. There's definitely a lot of advocacy going on. I mean, I'm queer and I'm here and I don't really have any intention of leaving, but then that's not the same for everyone. But I think it's a lot like, quite frankly, anywhere else. Where some persons are able to thrive and you're able to make a lot of advancements in one direction. And actually, when it became more public, you know, because we have our public advocates out there, that actually created a pushback, often funded by like US religious groups who have their money everywhere. And so there's been a strong pushback against it. But I think that was because we were making quite a few gains. Some persons have to leave and some persons have to stay, but a lot of persons have to leave in Jamaica for a number of reasons. We have like a huge migration. So it's both quite particular to some of us as queer communities, and some more than others, obviously, because I am cis and I can pass as straight, you know, and so for other groups, it's not necessarily as easy. But a lot of us are out here and we're trying and we're living life, you know, so.
I just wanted to circle back to us talking about what the words Black trauma actually means to us.
Yeah.
And I just want us to sit in why you're feeling you're having some resistance towards it, or why you're not feeling that it relates to you. You know, it can be multiple reasons, but I mean, in my personal practice, people have had resistance to the word trauma, and it could be because it doesn't exactly encompass how they're feeling. It could be that they don't want the label. It can be some internal struggles of like, I haven't fully understood what it means to take care of my mental health. It's just different ways. So I
don't have any resistance to the term in relation to me. It's how I see other persons use it.
Yeah.
And that's specifically in relation to books. Like in terms of that that binary of Black trauma and Black joy, I find those terms very reductive when it comes to literature, especially when I think about the books that they're used to describe. I think they do a disservice to the works that the writers are doing. And that's where I have issues with it, actually. But not like the actual, like the way how it's been defined here. That's, to me, quite accurate and very visible. in daily lives out here. But that's not where the resistance lies. It's more in terms of how I see persons use it. And so I tend to be more specific when I'm describing the books and not use a term sometimes, except when I really think it's needed, because I'm not sure how it's going to be read. I feel like it, I don't, but we'll get to that because, that's in the script.
Yeah. Thank you, Bree and Kiki, for talking about denial. That was something that, I don't know, I think was interesting for me as someone listening to discussions, like as someone who hasn't read a lot of like theory or like medical stuff, was sort of like, and whose exposure to that has mostly been through like Twitter and people talking about things online, was like a resistance to the idea of trauma and like being like, maybe that's for you, but I don't know if that's for me, and sort of like figuring out like, I don't know, I think Bree did a video where you're talking about like mental health, specifically in the deep, where I felt like there's something that you said about how you explain trauma that like really made things click for me. And so I thought that was like a very like important part of the discussion to have also in terms of like mental health and how that affects like words and word choice and how people react to certain labels. So thank you for that perspective.
Quick thing, and it was what I was thinking, and Miss WC Reader just brought it up. One of the things I don't like is that it has to be a Black trauma versus Black joy, which we'll get into later when we get to the questions. But I just wanted to keep that in mind, is that there's constantly this idea that Black trauma and Black joy cannot work together. And that annoys me a little bit, which is why I have some of the answers I do to the questions you have. But continue. I just wanted to bring that up because I think that's something we should think about.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we operate in this sphere that either or that black and white thinking, and really doing a disservice to things existing at the same time. So it's really difficult for me when people try to separate Black joy and Black trauma as if it's not like a spectrum or a continuous up and down thing. Like you can have all those things. It doesn't has to be just one or the other. So it's really hard sometimes for people to live in that gray where we should be living. But
for me, my experience of queerness means that I live in that gray. Like you know, because I'm a cisgender woman, as you've identified yourself as well, Kiki.
Yeah.
And I'm a queer woman, and I'm out, and I'm married to a woman. And so whenever I'm in a space, whether it's a space like a community group or an organization where everybody's Black and there's an assumption that we are united, that can be a traumatic. That's all I'm now experiencing that as I don't know if I would call that traumatic, but it creates anxiety for me, right? Because as we know, as Black queer folks, we're who pass, we're constantly coming out, right? It's not a singular experience.
Over and over.
Over and over, sometimes to the same bloody people. But I think like it is, so the joy that I experience is often in relation to a larger experience of trauma, right? It's more about, sometimes it's about moments of joy amidst all of the pain or the trauma, or in spite of the trauma, right? And the way that this bridges to literature is because I'm not afraid, and I enjoy reading books about Black trauma. And part of that is because I read science fiction and fantasy. And the types of books that I read tend to be aspirational, even if they spend time in the traumatic, right? So The Deep by River Solomon, aspirational. Pet by Akwaeke Emezi, traumatic, aspirational, right? Midnight Robber, Nalo Hopkinson, traumatic, aspirational, right? Anything that Octavia Butler has written, right? Trauma, aspirational, and also joyful, right? And so for me, the complexity of my Black queer experience is actually mirrored in the work that I read. And it's unfair, and frankly, it's lazy to suggest that these complex works are one or the other.
Thank you.
When
Thank you.
often the people who are writing them, with River Solomon as an example, when people who are writing them are very, very clear that they're writing them for the purpose of creating space for that complexity, right? So
Yeah.
I just, that's an important insertion. And for me as a queer person, I can't be other than that. I can't think other than that, because that would be to deny my everyday experience of that complexity.
Exactly. And they're creating space for those stories where they aren't given that space anywhere else, which is also like the other part of that for me, because I remember reading Patsy by Nicole Dennis Benn. And online, you know, there were some persons who were like, oh no, not this story again about a poor Black Jamaican mother and she has to migrate, da 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 da. We're tired of seeing these kind of stories, which is a critique that comes from some readers of Caribbean literature, like why always focus on this group of persons, why not others? And I thought, right, because you go on TV every day and just see a lot of stories and narratives about Black lesbians, right? With gender, like I couldn't even compute that kind of question, and also one that showed the complexity of what it is being queer in the US, which is presented to us as this sort of free liberation. I'm going to go over there and I'm going to be woohoo, and it's going to be queer utopia. You know? And it's like, and she had her own difficulties. Now that, I mean, and I used to live in Canada, and I know, like, that's bullshit, man. So they're so fucking racist. So I mean, so I was just like, as long as these stories are true, they need to be told. Period.
I will say that, like, being wait for it. Okay, I forgot to say that my pronouns are they them. I'm agendered high, but I really felt what Nadira was saying about like being invited into Black spaces, because a lot of the time I am invited into Black female spaces or Black women spaces, women empowerment places and stuff like that, and they automatically invite me. This like non-binary is welcome as well, and I'm just like, if I was a dude, you wouldn't, like, if I was male, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't particularly want that. And we know that because when you do that, I've actually tweeted about it before. It's like, when you do that, you are automatically telling me that you are not seeing me as non-binary. You are seeing me as another Black woman. And like, they say like, oh, well, you count too. It's like, I don't want to count. It's like, I don't count. And like, I'm all for like Black women empowerment movements. That's not the issue. It's just the idea that in trying to be more inclusive, they're more discriminatory, and it becomes a little bit. It gets to a point that because of what we consider Black trauma, I don't argue as much in that space, because I don't want to seem like self-hating, or, you know, someone who's trying to look down on stuff like that, or that I'm opposing them, because we are very, very easily our own worst enemy when it comes to that. The moment that somebody does not agree with what Blackness is to us, we automatically assume they're on someone else's side. And immediately the reaction is very, very volatile.
I remember Jesse making a similar critique when they got invited to, I think it was Well-Read Black Girls Lit Festival. And they did a whole video about that and how,
it doesn't feel good. It doesn't.
You need to, that's not the way to do it.
Because it really doesn't. It really proves that you don't actually look at us. You're just like, oh, there's a Black girl. We're going to invite them in. They don't actually look at what we're doing and who we are as people. It's very strange to me, but I understand like why it happens. I feel like that's one of those things that like gets a little bit overlooked as far as like queerness in the Black community, is how we tend to like lump everyone together in what way that makes us feel safe is based on appearance just as much as other people do to us as well, which it's learned behavior, but it's something we're talking about.
Thank you for sharing that, Harley. We've kind of moved on to the next question in terms of like what we think of like the discourse and some of like the dichotomies between trauma and joy. and like what are things that we think have been left out of the current like discussions of what is Black trauma. Is there anything else that people wanted to add to the point?
I think one of the main issues with what is considered Black trauma books, things that are, we'll go with what's really popular, and usually the loudest popular ones are YA, so I'm going to focus on that a little bit. But the things that are really popular in YA were things like Dear Martin, The Hate You Give, and ironically Children, Blood and Bone. But yeah, these were the three things that people said were super hyped, super pushed in publishing and everything. And my main problem with them was that rather than just presenting Black trauma, it's centralized Black trauma. And when I say that, it's like The Hate You Give mostly centers around a Black girl dealing with the aftermath of one of her friends getting shot. Dear Martin, the aftermath of like living in a very like poor place and having one of their friends also shot. A lot of it is violence towards children. Children of Blood and Bone, very much hyped on the violence and oppression that is done to us by other people. And because they centered so much on Black trauma, there wasn't anything to grasp onto that would help you heal from Black trauma, that would help you feel good about yourself afterwards. Like, these are like, instead of saying these are just our daily lives that happen and things that happen to us, there's like, this is something you need to look at it. You need to pay attention to this. If this makes you angry, why aren't you doing something about it? That sort of thing. It felt like something that isn't directed towards Blackness, basically. It's more directed in explaining us to other people. It's more so, it sounds like it's trying to humanize us for other people. And we as Black people do not need to be humanized to other people. We are human. What is more important to me is to have those moments, like you said, of Black joy in there. Like, the Black trauma is always going to be there. We know it very, very well. But being able to see the moments of levity, the moments of like joy and stuff like that, the things of us moving past is in the like forefront, instead of having the Black trauma that's in the forefront. Those things are really important to me, because it feels like they don't, it feels like they just are too focused on the pain and not so much on the people, basically.
You know, I think, how do I say this? I think a lot of the good literature, the emphasis being on good literature out there, manages this well.
Yes.
And I feel like, you know, when I think about, for example, a book that I haven't heard anybody talk about on BookTube or Bookstagram, The Summer We Got Free by Mia Mackenzie, which is a queer, there's a beautiful romance. There's a lot of different kinds of trauma in that story. Very queer. The way that Mackenzie is able to weave all of it, right? Like that story for me was about the experience, right? The Summer We Got Free, a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful story, right? And there are, like, in what I read, like, I'm not coming across a lot of stories that are trauma porn, which I think is what people are upset about, that it's simply, let me just show you how traumatic things were or are, and then let me show you again and again and again, the end. Like, I think that seems to me to be what people have issue with.
Yes.
And I feel like, but the writers out there who are dedicating themselves to their craft, right? And who are speaking about the Black experience, and stop me if you think I'm being judgmental, but also kind of on brand for me. I think there are a lot of people who are doing it really, really, really well. And also there's something very powerfully healing about being able to look trauma in the face and survive and be able to tell the story that happens after that, you know, and we need to, I think, as readers, respond to that and talk about how we're experiencing those stories, and and let it be known if those stories are working for us or not. And in my view, those kinds of stories, they work for me. I feel better after having read them. And I don't actually know. And even stories about like when people say, I don't want to read about trauma all the time, right? That's easily fixed. Don't read
Yes.
trauma,
the
right?
time.
Right.
There's other books out there.
Easily fixed, right? So for me, is the question like what is the debate about, right? Because there's reader's choice. And so is it about the way people are writing about trauma? Is it that it's hard to find stories that are not necessarily about that? Is it that people want good Black trauma stories and they feel like a lot of the stuff that's out there is mediocre? Like I'm not sure. It's not a question necessarily to you, Harley, but just generally, I'm often puzzled by that. And often it's a very American conversation.
Oh, it is,
As
yes.
well, because that's not the same kind of conversation that's happening in Canadian literary communities. And I'm not hearing that as a preoccupation coming out of other regions where there are huge numbers of the Black diaspora. So I'm not sure what I'm not sure what the problem might be.
The issue with it, because I'm on Twitter so much that I get to observe it a lot. The issue with it is publishing itself. And actually, it's finally come full circle with the whole own voices ideal. It's the idea that we have commodified Black trauma to a certain degree in the YA sphere. Now, mind you, adult books, I have tons of them that specifically balanced Black trauma and Black joy. But those do not get the exposure that, unfortunately, YA does in the book community. And so YA sets the standard, supposedly, quote unquote standard. This can be contested, but it sets the standard in the book community of what is present in literature. Technically shouldn't, but it does. So if you have things like older books or newer adult books that come out, you don't hear about them as often as you hear about the next YA novel done by a Black author or about Black issues and stuff. So then when you have a bunch of people who are now latching on to those books to essentially learn about us, I suppose, and unlearn their own racism, those books like They Hate You Give and stuff like that, which do more explaining of who we are, get pushed to the forefront and held on the highest pedestal. So now this discussion comes up a lot because there are Black people who are tired of reading about that thing, but they don't have the exposure to know that we have those things out there, which it can really be put on publishing. It can be, but also it is put on the people who consume it as well. And whoever's consuming controls essentially what publishing is going to do, because publishing is going to always make money. And there's a lot of, from authors, there's a lot of them saying that a lot of their books have been pressured to feature more quote unquote Blackness. And when they say Blackness, they mean Black trauma. And it's basically a full circle of like stuff. Everyone has their own means of perpetuating it, essentially.
Yeah, that's interesting because on Bookstagram, Bookstagram can be very niche. Like everyone's sort of like in their own network. So like that conversation around YA books and the kind of popular YA books, I'm like completely, oh, okay. Is that where it's coming from? Because I had no idea. Like, I think in the space where I'm in, it's definitely more of the adult titles, and it's definitely more of the adult literary fiction titles, I suppose. And it doesn't get so much. I think the problem there is that the writers, in my opinion, are good and are offering really complex stories, but because of the setting or the plot description, they immediately get labeled as, oh, this is a book about Black trauma. And then I read them and I go, oh, what are you talking about? And I just, and these are persons who I assume read them too. Let me not swear for them. Who knows? And I think it's definitely publishing, but then I wonder sometimes if readers have sort of internalized, I suppose, what publishing has put out there in certain media narratives and have imposed them on the book, such that even when they're being presented with complexity, this is what they zero in on, or this is maybe what they post about, even if that's maybe not necessarily the totality of their reading experience, because they think this is what's current and this is what is representative and this is what will attract, I suppose, other readers. And I get, very annoyed about that. Yeah.
I can't help but to, I'm like trying to word this. So I also tend to talk slower when I'm trying to process. So I just want y'all to know that. I tend to think about the reader every time someone says, I don't like Black trauma, or I'm tired of reading about Black trauma. I'm noticing that there's a trend in this conversation that you're thinking about the author or the publisher or the external thing. And I tend to right away think about the reader. Because if you're saying, in my mind, and also I'm using my therapeutic lens right now, if you're saying, I don't like to read Black trauma, then what is triggering you? What type of narratives are you consuming that is re-traumatizing you? And what are you doing to work on that? Like, what healing are you doing to address those things, sit in it, and learn how to break those generational curses? Because there's something about the reading that is not fitting well with you. But it's also equally okay, like Jerry said, pick another book that you can literally read whatever else you want to read. You don't have to sit there and subject yourself to something that's going to traumatize you, because you can say like, oh, I'm healing, I'm working on this, and still be traumatized by something. Like, healing is not a destination and you got there, and it's not what I like to say, woke. I hate the word woke. I'm just going to say I don't like wokeness because it to me implies level 57 on a game, and that once you got there, you nailed it. So for me, it's like I just be wanting to know, what is it stirring inside of the reader that it's making them uncomfortable, that they are not able to process the literature. And I also wanted to go to a point that y'all talked about the good writers out there. So for me, Black trauma healing needs to happen collectively. That's just how I view it. It needs to be a community thing. It needs to be you speaking about it, other people hearing you. It needs to happen collectively. It cannot be individual. It just can't, in my mind. It needs to be collectively. So a book I read recently called Black Girl Unlimited personifies that to a T. Like, this girl Echo was going through it all, y'all. Sexual trauma, dealing with her mother being addicted to substances, and how her community came together. We're talking about grandma down the street in a house. Granny's like 100 years old, and she contributed. I just feel like if we're going to talk about our intergenerational trauma that often happens in different Black communities around the world, then the healing need to be intergenerational, if that makes sense. So I'm always just thinking about the reader, and I'm wondering if the reader is thinking about their word choice and how saying, well, I don't want to read Black trauma, how that can silence other people and, not making them feel that they don't have the space to consume that, or they don't have the space to even write that for authors. So I don't know. That was very long-winded. I hope that.
No, I loved it. I loved it, especially the last part, because I remember seeing on Twitter LL McKinney. I think
I was just going to talk about her in the Nightmareverse.
Oh, you're right, because she's writing a new book right now. And I remember her, I felt this so much. She came out on Twitter and did like, I mean, I don't know her motivations for doing this, so I'm not going to read anything into it, but she did a thread where she's writing a book, and I guess it probably deals with racism. Like there's an element of it in there. And she did a long thread basically where, to me, it read as if she felt like she had to defend her choice of making that a part of her book. And she was like, I'm not centering it and I'm not doing this and that, but it is a part of the book. And I've already written a book that's more, you know, fun and whatever. And I get to do this now. And I was like, I hate that you, like, maybe she's just expressing this to express this, but to me, it felt like a preemptive defensive move in response to person saying things like, oh no, not another Black trauma book. Like, you know, like, and it hurt me that she felt she had to do that. Like, I don't want persons to feel limited on these kind of topics where there's so many more stories to tell across the board from whatever angle and from whatever region and perspective. And it's about publishing all of them, not about trying to shrink one to make room for the other or anything like, or that you can even reduce books to that kind of block or binary unit where you can, okay, well, that one is this, so we're going to throw that one out and take this one, and then it's going to represent that more. It was rough.
And it's interesting because I don't hear other racialized writers having to struggle, right? Like, I'm not hearing an issue with, you know, enter whatever racial group here and then hyphenate and say trauma, right? I hear it about Black people and Black writers, and in particular Black women, right? And non-binary people and Black femmes in particular. That's where I'm hearing the conversation located. And in that community, from the perspectives of those writers on Twitter, I hear a lot of Black femme writers saying, in particular, stop telling me what my work is, right? Stop calling my work has young people in it, but it's not YA. Stop calling this book YA, right?
Yes.
This is a romance, or this is a whatever. Stop calling it whatever. Like, I have the autonomy to call my work whatever it is. You might connect to the trauma. You might connect to whatever it is that's in there, but you have to take responsibility for what you're pulling out from the work, right? And what you're emphasizing in the work. And that's what the reader is doing, right? Because I'm sure that there are people out there, writers out there, who would have a lot of problems with their work being labeled Black trauma, knowing that that label will lead to, you know, certain outcomes in terms of whether someone's going to take it off the shelf. So, for example, a great example, Bree, you just talked about Black Girl Unlimited. I purchased that book. It's on the shelf. I've heard that book described as a book that really gets, like, it's misleading, right? I've heard many people say that the cover of the book is misleading because the magical system is more of a metaphor as opposed to an actual magic, right? And so that I haven't read it. People I trust, whose reviews I trust and whose opinions I trust, have described it in that way. I'm not talking 2 people. I'm talking like about 7 people that I know have described that book as being, number one, more traumatic than it might seem, like if you just look at the cover and read the back. So people have described being caught off guard by the trauma. And then also, you know, also not being too heavy, not being very heavy on like magic and other things. I haven't read it. I want to read it. But it's interesting because when I look at, with the exception of Marlon James's Leopard Wolf, I keep on forgetting the colors.
Oh, Black Leopard, Red Wolf. Yeah. Sorry, it was one of my favorite books.
Okay. So I'm glad to hear that. I haven't read it yet, but it's interesting. When Black male or masculine writers write about Black trauma, I don't hear the same kind of pushback, right? And so, for example, The Water Dancer was all about trauma. People had issues with it, right? In the literary community. I personally very much enjoyed it, but it was never described as a Black trauma book to me.
That's very true.
The only
it
exception
wasn't.
is Marlon James's Leopard Wolf. People were concerned
Really
about,
janked it up there.
yeah, right. But a lot of the books written by Black men or Black masculine people, like for example, War Girls, there was trauma up and down that book, but it never got described as a Black trauma book, right? And so for me, I'm like, listen, we need to be really careful about what arguments we also like adopt as readers and what we perpetuate, because the writers who are getting typecast are I think I'm going to suggest for the most part are Black women and Black femmes in their writing, and that has an impact on sales, and it has an impact on reviews and an impact on the hype train, which is why for me I'm like I'm not sure I want to get into that and give more oxygen to those framings, because they're not universally used.
Right. That's my same misgiving.
I will say that as far as Ella McKinnon feeling like she needed to defend it, I believe, and I'm not blaming her, but there is such a thing as digging your own hole. She essentially, because of her, no, I'm not blaming her as in like, oh, it's all your fault. I'm saying that she overcompensated a lot using her Twitter. She did a lot of like call outs against like other authors and stuff like that about racist things. She made her entire platform, despite her books being fantasy and stuff and Black girl magic and stuff like that. A lot of her as an author that the public sees is her calling out racism and railing against any and all things. So when she finally she basically made herself about this thing and saying how people that Black people don't need to have to write racism and stuff in order for them. Hey, we can write joy, we can write magic, we can write Black girls doing anything. That's what she railed really, really hard against. So now she wants to write a story that includes a lot like racism and stuff. So now she's probably preemptively feeling like she has to defend herself because this is what she's made herself about. So like for that, I feel like that's probably why she felt the need to do it. And also why probably some of her followers are going to be like, hey, what's this? Because I won't say it contradicts it, but from the outside looking in, it contradicts it. I don't think it contradicts it at all, because I mean, she's Black. At some point, racism is going to play a part in her personal stories and the idea she comes up with. It's inescapable. But when you decide that you want to write one that includes it, after making off about saying that Black people shouldn't have to write about this sort of thing, and the guys are just racist asking for that sort of thing, having to make a disclaimer is probably just her defensive, basically backed herself into a corner, essentially, and now she's moving past out of it. That's what I would say about it.
Can I
Oh, Brie, do you want to go? You've been kind of quiet this conversation.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
It's a little buggy on my end, so things are getting a little jittery. I'm trying to keep track of everybody.
I'm really here for the conversation, so I'm just absorbing for the most part. I did want to ask Injuri a question about not wanting to participate in narratives that are not universal. Do you think that connects to, and I'm paraphrasing on what you're saying, like you're saying, I don't want to, you don't know if you want to be a part of, when we were talking about, oh my God, why am I losing it? But anyway.
Oh, about Black women being presented as only writing Black trauma and stuff like that, and the pushback against it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And you're saying that it's not universal, which I agree. Do you think that has something to do with your personal narrative of reading with purpose?
I mean, I think so, but it's, for me, my point was that what we give energy to through our words and our attention, right, ends up growing, right, and taking up more space. And what we don't talk about doesn't get the opportunity to be aired out in that way. So in a way, it's not so much reading with purpose, but it's speaking with purpose and engaging in dialogues purposefully, so as to divert attention from things that don't serve, and to direct attention toward things that do. So in this conversation, it's important to me to say that I read books that include narratives of what what is called Black trauma, right? Or commonly understood as Black trauma. And I find those books healing. And that I have had the pleasure and the privilege of being introduced to writers who are so careful in the way that they parse out Black trauma that it's a good experience for me. And so that's important. That's a perspective in this discussion today, but generally that I want to spend time and give air to. I don't want to give oxygen to a dichotomy that I think is false. So I think it's very, very problematic to not acknowledge the coexistence of trauma and joy. And I think it denies the experience that many people who identify as Black have on a day-to-day basis. And I'm not about denying Black experience. So in some ways it is connected to that. But also, and it's interesting, just to go sideways for a second, something that you said, actually there's 2 points that I want to make. One, I say this respectfully, I think that we need to be careful, and this is specifically in response to your point, Harley. I think we need to be careful especially when we're dealing with writers who are very active on Twitter. I think we have to be careful about, how we talk about, and you were careful to say, I don't know L.L. McKinney's motivations, but I know that there are a number of authors who are very, very public on Twitter about some things, but not all things. Yes. And it's very easy in the age of social media, saying this as somebody who spent a lot of her life when there was no such thing as social media, it's very easy. So it's very easy to believe that we sort of know people more than we actually do because of what they choose to share over social media. I don't know LL McKinney and so on, but I have seen generally, in particular, Black femme authors being really slammed over social media because they're expressing a position that they have in the moment. And I think that as readers, it's important for us to also give them space to try things out, express a view, deviate from that view, and yes, be accountable for that deviation if they choose to. But I think it's really important to free that up a little bit. And your comments earlier got me wondering if we were doing that in this conversation as far as L.M. McKinney was concerned. So I just want to say that because it's something that I worry about, because we have such a significant platform as Black identified readers across the gender spectrum, right? And I think that I feel very protective of our writers, and I want our writers to do well. And I know that our writers get punished more than others, and they get off listed quicker and more permanently than others. Like Stephen King is still writing, and people who have read that work have been like, this is legit racist.
Legit.
100%. He still gets to write, but somebody else, a Black woman, puts out a debut that's garbage, and no one returns for the next thing, right? And that's just it's just a thought that I wanted to express around that.
I feel that.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was trying to caveat. Like, look, I don't know what her motivations is. Yeah. It's just that this is all people see. So I only base it on what she has out there for people to see. Which in that I always say that I'm like, hey, you don't know what they're doing behind that screen, which is an overall issue in the book community when it comes to Black books and stuff like that. Is that, and I actually wanted to bring this up earlier, like Black books and Own Voices books and things like that, is that they focus so hard on the identity of the author, they don't see them as human anymore. So when they do something, they automatically are already on this pedestal that we have because they wrote one thing that we like, and it is supposed to be representative of the entirety of that particular identity, and therefore they can't do this, they can't do that, they can't say this, they can't say that, even if it's true to their experience. And only just recently, people have noticed that publishers are taking advantage of that. And so it becomes easier for them to say, oh, you messed up. You said this. We're axing your book. Or, oh, you need to put a little more of this in there so that it fits the identity. Or, oh, you need to tell people that you're queer or Black or like this particular descent. It'll help you sell more books and stuff like that. There's this pressure to be as Black as possible in the stereotypical sense, I guess you could say, when it comes to like releasing your debuts and releasing books and stuff like that, just to get people interested. It's like, I'm Black, I wrote this book, they're Black as well. It is me writing from my experience and stuff. And the moment that that experience doesn't match with something palatable, automatically they axe it, which was something I had always thought was a danger with when Own Voices first started to prop up. Because it's not that I thought it was a bad movement. I thought it was a good idea because it allowed space for us to be writers. But I already knew, because publishing and because readers, and we have a lot of fault in this as well, readers are a certain way and they want to see themselves represented. But the problem is when we want to see ourselves represented, when we don't, we feel a type of way. And I notice this a lot in the YA sphere. So now, authors are noticing that publishing is taking so much advantage of that they can't write anything else. And they can't write about this, they can't write about that and stuff like that, because they've made themselves, their names off of Own Voices, just like Ellen McKinnon has made herself a public figure in the form of like activism and pushing that racism doesn't have to always be part of the narrative. So like it forces them to stay pigeonholed. And I think that also has a lot to do with the problem of having people say that they're tired of Black trauma, because Black trauma is so centered. I would say that the authors are kind of tired of it too and want to write something else as well.
And I would love to see how how your perspective applies to African descended and Black authors outside of North America. I've had the opportunity to hear Dr. Karen Lord speak who's an exquisite writer. And I've had the opportunity to hear her speak about her writing and her work. And I think that there are, like, Dr. Lord is an example, and there are other examples of writers, albeit they, for the most part, write adult science fiction and fantasy, because that's what I read for the most part, but are talking about finding publishers and working with smaller presses. And of course, there are cons to that.
Yeah.
But working with smaller presses and independent presses that are committed to publishing stories that serve, right? Publishing stories that serve us. So, I think about somebody like Akwaeke Emezi and look at like the Pet, Freshwater, Death of Vivek Oji. And then there's a spiritual memoir coming out later this year. And just seeing that, they seem to be an author who is staying on task in terms of what they're interested in writing. And like Eugene Bacon, who's an African Australian writer, has started to really revolutionize how science fiction gets written by writing books with like other people with multiple voices together. And I know that's been done before, but it's to hear her speak about that is really amazing. So, I wonder about the YA machine, the in particular, the American YA publishing machine, right? The industrial complex of YA churning out, right? Same covers, same arcs, right? Churning that out, and what that, and how that influences the rest of the rest of the literature that we're reading. And I wonder if it is like something that readers of YA need to speak about more, and sort of push back and say, like, actually we're buying other stories, right? We want more from our authors, because it is being done.
Yeah, it is.
It's being done right elsewhere.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, actually, I can bring up Jordan Ifueko for this. I feel like I always mispronounce her name. Ifueko. Sorry, Ifueko. Thank you. She actually said in an interview, which she was very resistant to when she decided to publish Raybearer, She talked about how American publishing wanted her to make it more African in a sort of fetishy way, like a more voyeuristic way, for the palatability of the general audience being white. There is, I will say, there is a push on African authors who are being published here, not specifically Black, but just African American authors, like actual African American authors, to bring more of their Africanness into the conversation instead of just saying, hey, I'm writing something inspired by my heritage. But there's like a push to say, hey, make it more African, make it more exotic, bring more of this into there for the pleasure of the general audience, not write a good story or write about your experience or anything like that. So in a way, for Blackness, it's all about push you to write more Blackness, and our Blackness is mostly just suffering and having people do things. For Africans, it's write more about African, make it more about this mythical country that you come from. And it's very voyeuristic and fetishizing, essentially.
Yeah. I think
go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm curious about I have a question. I just had a question for Kiki about how, like, Caribbean writers and what, how this question, because earlier when you talked about Black trauma and how that as a theme gets taken up or doesn't get taken up, right? Because it contradicts the independence narrative, right? I wonder about like how these themes map onto the literary communities that you're a part of in Jamaica in particular, but with your work with Rebel Women's Lit, like reading across the Caribbean.
Yeah, I mean, I was listening to the conversation and really processing because thinking, and because on the one hand, I definitely feel it for the authors, for example, like Jordan Ifueko, where she was saying, they want her to make it more African, whatever the heck that means. And also thinking about how Toni Morrison said that she read African writers to better able develop a way of writing beyond the white gaze and not really thinking about white folks when you're writing. And like for Caribbean authors, where so many of our authors are abroad, and so many are diaspora, and what that separation can mean. I find that there are some who, like Dr. Karen Lord, will go alternative routes and be a little more particular with their publishers and really fight to ensure that their works are what they want it to be. And like she said, she will pick like a local editor to look at it first before she, presents it to an overseas publisher, so that when she gets any kind of critiques from them, she can go, oh, well, no, and she already has her argument ready. And yet I have to say that they are some authors whom, in my opinion, I suppose have capitulated to a foreign idea of, or what is legible to foreign audiences. And because we in the Caribbean as readers are not seen as a market, it doesn't even really matter what we think. It doesn't matter if we categorize it as A, B, C, D, or E, because they're presenting it to a US market or a UK market or a Canadian market. And as long as it reads legible to them, like I remember one US reader of a YA title allegedly set in Jamaica that had elementary schools and chipmunks and what have you, which we don't have.
You don't have chipmunks.
Sorry. And I mean, it said, no, we don't. Last time I checked, lizards, but not chipmunks. And we don't really, elementary US thing, like we have primary schools or private preps, so like there were certain things that were done, which to me was clearly not about home audience, or like books that are written over there and there's none of our local language in it at all. It's just like this really straight, proper Jane Austen English. And we are, I guess we're told like what to accept that as what has to happen. because that's what they need to get published, or this is what it means to be universal, because they have to understand. And I really struggle with that. So it's like I absolutely would like to support authors and I want them to have their books out there, but I think there are some of them who are using us as diversity points to get their books out there. And from a Caribbean perspective, I just have to inject that one out there. And sometimes I wonder if they do sensationalize certain aspects of us, because that's what their editor understands, who is inevitably white. Inevitably. I mean, there's even, I can't get into it. There's another big YA title, I think, coming out. And I have to tell you, like, this year I actually made a point of I'm just getting books from university presses or whatever, because I was just getting so angry at what I was seeing coming out and saying that this is a Jamaican or Caribbean literature.
I really think I know what you're talking about, and I don't know you very well, but I feel like I know you well enough to know that you're not going to name names. But could you, like, okay, so my parents are from Trinidad.
Sure.
I'm Canadian. If I'm talking to somebody who's born in Trinidad, I lead with Canadian. And if I'm talking to other people, I lead with Trinidad. That's just how my identity works, right? I'm Trinidadian by heritage, Canadian born person. And so, and this year I decided I wanted to prioritize stories written by Caribbean authors, because that's an area in science fiction and fantasy. I found it more difficult to find works within those genres, right? Apart, of like writers living in the Caribbean, publishing in the Caribbean, and so on, right? So that's something that I have been trying to do. And so in doing that, I've Googled like Caribbean author, science fiction, fantasy. And this year I have noticed a lot more names, a lot more books than last year and the year before, which filled me with excitement, because I was like, oh, cool, there's going to be a lot of really interesting stuff to read this year. But then I kind of noticed something that I feel like you're talking about. And I wonder if that desire, right, that desire to read more Caribbean books, right, as that becomes something that's maybe popularized and maybe as publishers become aware of it, whether that might actually have the opposite impact, right, for Caribbean writers, that the bigger houses, all you need to do is like take this hero, put her in Grenada and put a cape on her and we're good, right? And I wonder,
wait.
Yeah. So, I guess because
Wow.
we're talking about like Black trauma, like I'm just wondering if we can talk about like Black trauma stories situated in the Caribbean and what a push to read diversely, whether that actually might have like a negative impact on the kind of work that we get access to.
I would say absolutely. I mean, it comes in trends. There are always these waves where you kind of see like a lot more Caribbean authors getting book deals, and then it dips and then it comes back. But I find, interestingly enough, that sometimes it tends to go into extremes. So sometimes it's like they really push on the trauma, I guess, when they're saying that they're presenting it as perhaps being more Jamaican or more Caribbean, because that's what is also tends to be associated with us. And I would say, as a Caribbean queer person, queer violence out here, yes, like especially I would speak for Jamaica, but also others where like, well, that's what it's expected, to the point where when I read Patsy and at the end it wasn't like it wasn't like a tragic ending. I was sort of uncomfortable, like it felt unrealistic, even though I would be the first person to say that, yes, thank you, some of us are here and we find some kind of happiness. It's possible, like wherever we are, we do. But seeing it in a book felt weird to me. And I had to like sit with that. Like, why is it? Because the characters are okay and being able to achieve some of the things, that it's not like it's a happily ever after, and it's not that. It's just that they found some measure of joy. Why is that unrealistic to you? Like, and I really had to like sit with that a while, because it's not necessarily the narrative that's presented. Even if I'm living it, somehow you live it, but you don't see it, and there's this weird disconnect. I can't explain it. So like you have like books that lean into that direction, and then sometimes you have others that erase some of the trauma entirely, or what they do is that the setting, even though it's supposed to be in the Caribbean, is very generic. And when it's generic, that means you're gonna have to remove some of that very specific Black trauma. And you might deal with other things that are relatable and that are traumatic, but perhaps not necessarily with a racial element. And that gets presented as, and this is a Caribbean book, and I read it, and I'm like, this story could have happened anywhere. Like it didn't have, like, there's nothing about this story that has to be set here. Nothing at all. Like you could have just picked any old random island across any, because everyone has people that die. Like it's not, and you wonder, like, you know, like it's just that generic setting. And actually for me, it's, I don't know, is the word to use traumatizing, but it actually hurts me when I read those books and see our reality erased. So there was, and I'm not naming names, but it was a book, and they had a plantation house in the book and the setting, and they kind of just treated it like an amusement park. Like it was just like, ooh, fun times. Wow, it's scary and it's so mysterious. And who's this eccentric relative in the house? Ooh la la. And it kind of read like Enid Blyton. Honestly, you know, it's like they gave a basic description of like, yes, this was here because of slavery times. But when you actually like read the story, none of that is in it. Like none of that legacy is in it. And as someone who was born and raised in a city with a major plantation house there that was a tourist attraction, like that's not how that works. That's not how it works as an African descendant in a Caribbean country when you live close to a plantation house. There are memories, whether you acknowledge it or not. Like there's some kind of tension. Like there, even as a kid, when you don't know that there's something there, and none of that was in the book. It was just like ooh la la, you know. But this is in Jamaica, and it's a book about authentic Jamaican culture. So it's you know, I kind of wish almost that we had like that power of those YA readers online. Like, yeah, could you not do this to our books and present it as, I don't know, but the writers want their books published, you know?
I will say the book community is very American focused. I will never deny that. But I do feel where you're coming from with that. Because I mostly see it in adult books where it's done well. So there's something to be said about being able to read something that takes place where you live and see the small, subtle places and streets and roads and things going on and stuff. It's like, hey, you go past that street. I was like, I walk past that street every day and I know what's going on. It's in here. There's something to be said about that, which is why I understand when people say, hey, if you're not from there, don't write about there. And it's like, I do agree with that particular type of gatekeeping. I do agree with, because you're never going to know that same feeling being in those places. And I see what you're saying, because everything you just said sounds weird, because you can't divorce the setting from the story.
You can't.
You cannot.
That's exactly how I feel. That's why I'm.
Nolan's reads.
Yeah.
Let's put a stop to that.
Yeah. I'm always reading books about New Orleans because I'm like,
girl, don't get me started.
Right. Like ever gets it right. Like the other day, I went to this restaurant. I live in Minnesota, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we have jambalaya." Gives me the jambalaya.
No, it's not. I already said no.
It had carrots in it, so I was confused. So anyway, that's not the point. The point is, it's like I can't do it. So I was thinking earlier too, Harley, about like the gatekeepers and like the harm that they're doing, whether intentionally or not. And even if you're doing it out of good and in good intentions, doesn't mean the impact is not devastating. So when Kiki, you're talking about your book specifically from that Jamaican lens, my father's side, my heritage on my father's side is Jamaican. And even though I haven't been to Jamaica or had any access to it, I tend to be very critical when I'm reading books that have a Jamaican setting, because I'm like, how true is this? like how how is this living up to the actual world? So I just wanted to say something.
I take that with a grain of salt because, like, Creole, Haitian Creole, hi. So, like, they tend to, when people tend to set things in New Orleans or in Southern Louisiana in any form, or they tend to set it in Haiti, none of it reflects anything that my family has ever said, taught me, or spoken about, or told me about in any way.
Amen.
And that drives me a little bit to over here because I'm just like, how do you want to write about this thing and completely divorce the culture of that setting from your story? I understand wanting to be like, oh, say you're writing a romance and you're just like, oh, this romance takes place in New Orleans as a tourist. My thing is that when they write certain romance, they say these people are actually from here, and I'm just like, no, you're not. You're from like Indiana or something. You're from Ohio. You're not from here.
I think the thing that really bothers me is when authors have the caucasity, because that's what I view it as, the caucasity to set something in New Orleans and there's not a native or Black person in sight. In sight. So I'd be like, there's no Indigenous person in here. And they go through history. It'll be like, setting in 1700. Nothing. And I'm like, oh, this was just white land?
That's what they think. I will say, though, that Caribbean science fiction and fantasy writers, I think, have actually been really good, even though their settings are speculative, to be very true to this space. Very, I would say, especially Midnight Robber with Nalo Hopkinson, as an example of the world building there. The boundaries they push somehow in sort of changing and fusing geography, and in my opinion, like queering the space sometimes feels way more closer to how I see and feel about us than some realist writers.
Could you give some examples of like for people in the chat and also myself who want to read like science fiction and fantasy writers from the Caribbean who are doing it right? Like who are you enjoying?
Like this isn't my niche area, but I absolutely would put Karen Lord, Nalo Hopkinson. This is terrible when I have to think of names. I can't come up with them. This writer, yeah. I will say too, another element of Caribbean fiction is that our writers and the work don't necessarily fall very easily into the categories of realist literary fiction and then fantasy science fiction. We go across boundaries. It's very porous for us. So, for example, the book I'm going to mention now, which is Marvelous Equations of the Dread by Marcia Douglas, which actually got featured on tour. I think what did they call it, a fantasy book? And I was about to get really angry at the article title, but the writer did write by the book. So we're going to ignore the headline. The way how she wrote about the book did justice to it. That one is very speculative, and it goes through the history and different cultures that exist in Jamaica through particular characters. And it's very musical and very poetic and very real to how we live, but also very speculative. It's so hard to describe. Like, it's a very hard book to categorize, but I would mention that one in particular as one to consider as well. And I think, I'm looking at my bookshelf right now, but it's too far and I can't read the titles. Oh, do you know who I'm going to mention too, though? Even though his books aren't necessarily set physically in the Caribbean, but who definitely brings the Caribbean into his understanding of the Americas, and that's P. Jelly Clark.
Yes.
Who, like with the Black God Drums, I said, I described that book as the first book I had seen that had written about New Orleans of the Americas rather than as of America, which is how I tend to see it everywhere else. Like this was in New Orleans, I saw that the historians spoke about, but I didn't really see anywhere else. And so Black God's Drums and then even Ring Shout, where might perhaps seem very USian, and it is, but even the Ring Shout and the Gullah Geechee in terms of their language, like I was reading those lines in Ring Shout and I thought, well, let me say it out loud because it's easier to understand. And I found myself substituting Jamaican patois words into it without realizing it. And I was like, oh, wait, what? And I read up on it and I realized that actually, yeah, it's quite close to some of our Caribbean patois. And when I read up on a book about Ring Shout, one of the persons who was like a leader of a Ring Shout group said that his ancestors came through Bahamas. And so the way how they spoke, and he didn't even call it Gullah Geechee language because he said that's not what we call it. That's what I hear other persons call it. He said like it still has a Bahamian kind of, I guess, lilt or insert. So I would actually, yeah, Jelly Clark knows what he's doing. I wish more Black Atlantic historians wrote like speculative fiction. Like it would just make my day. So those are some names, and I'm sure I'm missing a whole ton. Oh my gosh, Cadwell Turnbull.
Yes.
Oh my God.
I'm getting a bunch of recommendations here.
The lesson was so good.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Like I know there's others, but yeah,
there's also I haven't read Unique Tiffany Unique, yeah, The Land of Something and Drowning.
Love. I haven't read that book yet. Actually, I only read her short stories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I just I know people watch this, and I certainly watch like talks like this to get recommendations, that do it right. And I feel like there's so many wonderful writers out there who are writing either, because I think P. Jelly Clark is an excellent example. Oh, and same with he's not Caribbean, but help me with this, Chloe. A Taste of Honey.
Oh,
Kai Ashanti Wilson, right? Can write from a place of like A Taste of Honey and Sorcerers of the Wild Deep. There are narratives. Wow. There's a lot of heterosexism. There's a lot of homophobia and a lot of violence, and so much more in the story, right? That it's not looking away, right? But it's taking it all in and then focusing in on the love, the hope, and the possibility and the innovation. And Nisi Shawl and Everfair, like when you start getting into stuff like love of nation and love of people, right? Like there's so much really amazing stuff, like the recreation of the past, those stories like Everfair and She Would Be King. Those kinds of stories are really powerful as well, and trauma's there, but there's so much more to pick up and read. Of course, Nnedi Okorafor and Who Fears Death, right? Like trauma, Book of Phoenix, right? Trauma, and so much more.
Yeah. Oh, and then another writer who because she had like basically zombie stories in her book, Leonie Ross, who did the collection.
I've actually heard of her, yes.
Yeah, Come Let Us Sing Anyway. That collection of stories, definitely speculative. Again, wasn't written that way, but when I was reading it, it reminded me a bit of Carmen Maria Machado's debut collection, Her Body and Other Parts. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that book got so much buzz in literary spaces, and I think like Come Let Us Sing Anyway is sort of in a similar conversation, but didn't get the same kind of push. So again, like some of these books aren't necessarily marketed as fantasy and science fiction, but I just don't think Caribbean writers necessarily fit as easily into those categories because of our writing traditions, where we
sorry, go ahead.
And also as we said on Black Prose Club, like those categorizations aren't ours.
No.
Right.
That was actually one of the issues I had with Black Leopard Red Wolf. I was happy to see it debut in like high fantasy that made me very, very happy. But then about, well, I want to say a couple of months later, they moved it out of there to literary because they said it's not fantasy, it's literature. Like it's literary. And I was just like, why? Because he's a literary writer. No, he's not. He's a magical realism writer. What are you talking about? It's just like, no, they considered that literature. And I was just like, so you're
it's all literature.
Yeah, they're using that literary thing where they're just like, it can't be in a genre if it's presented as quote unquote literary. And I really hate that because there's also the assumption, it's a very American assumption, but there's also the assumption that there aren't enough Black authors in fantasy and stuff like that. It's not that, it's just they move us somewhere else where we can't be found, where like most genre readers don't go.
I always find
it like I just don't even go ahead, Bree, sorry.
No. I just always find it interesting that I don't find our white counterpart authors having to go through these changes of genres in a manner in which our African diasporic or Black authors have to go to. So, I mean, that's telling, but it's like it's constantly being moved out, pushed in. Like, why would you tell an author what they're writing? It kind of reminds me of, I haven't seen these movies, please don't judge me, but I haven't seen Get Out or like the movie. I know, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I also was not in the US.
I thought that would be, I thought that would be like a psychologist's thing.
No, I was not in the US when this happened. And then when I got here, people were like, Get Out. And I just haven't gotten to it. But people were saying they classified it as something. And then what's his name? What's his name? Jordan Peele. Jordan Peele was like, no, that was a horror. Like being like, no, that was a horror film. And people are like, oh no, it was this and that. And I just don't understand why. I mean, we understand, we know, but it just baffles me over and over again why we can't set our own parameters.
I think this is why things, as far as like the book community, keep going in a cycle the way it does. Because people have had this conversation that we're having right now already before, a year ago, and the year before that, and the year before that. And the problem has always been the fact that we try to fix the authors. We should be trying to fix the publishers who set the standards.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the ones who move our stories around. They're the ones who decide whether our stories are Black enough or African enough or any other marginalization enough. And also, they get to set the standard of what's acceptable about us.
Mm-hmm.
And the majority of publishing is white female. Yeah. And it's kind of telling that white cis females get to decide what's queer enough, what's Black enough, what's this culture enough, and everything else.
While profiting off of us.
While also scapegoating their white male counterparts for those issues.
Being gatekeepers. It's just so...
Yep. It's so weird, honestly. I found that out, that the majority of publishing is ran by white cis women. Like even in the CEO positions and stuff like that. And like it put a whole new like telling perspective on the people who said, well, publishing is so male and that's why I can't succeed in it. And I'm looking at that, I'm like, you should probably just talk to your people. I'm just saying. But finding that out that statistically most of the people who hold the power in publishing are white and female made a lot more sense as to why even when they tried to be more inclusive, they completely like it. I think that has to do with like if publishing doesn't change, there continue to be these issues. Now, for me, I'm of the belief that if you can't change that, go somewhere else, which is we should build our own like publishing, like imprints and stuff like that. And I know it's a hard market to get into, but it's not impossible. There are small imprints and stuff like that that we can build so that we can present our stories the way they're meant to be told. And like, I feel like it starts at the bottom to Black agents, Black editors, Black people who know business and like lawyers and stuff like that coming together to create these publishing houses. But it would take basically an act of God right now to get people to look that way, but it's not impossible.
And I
Yeah.
think as in terms of like our own sphere of influence as influencers in the bookish communities, we can talk about we can lift up presses. Like I lift up BLF Press, for example. BLF Press produced, like, if you look, like, it's one of the few presses. It's a small press, Black woman owned. When you go to their website, it's one of the few websites that I'll go to and I want every single book that has come out of the press. Right? I'm not even picking and choosing. I'm just like, if BLF has pressed it, I want it. So like Crystal A. Smith's collection of short stories and flash fiction called Two Moons Stories. Stunning work.
Yeah, she has
Absolutely.
poems coming out.
Yeah, she has poems, and one of those poems is speculative, which is really cool. But like Crystal A. Smith is Instabuy. And so there are lots of like really small presses that are coming out with amazing. Aqueduct does some really fascinating things. And you know, I'm trying to get better as a consumer of books and a collector of books to really think about, you know, who I'm supporting. And while I'm not there right now, because right now I'm driven by what the story is about. So to be completely like honest, if there's a Black mermaid on it and it's written by a Black author, I'm going to buy it no matter who wrote it and who published it. That's where I am today. That might not be the case in a year, but at some point I do see myself like being more specific and more purposeful around the publishing houses that I support through my dollars and also through the platform.
Yeah.
And
I feel the same. Yeah, I feel the same about Blue Banyan Books, which is a Jamaican publisher.
Okay.
Yeah, they're based in Jamaica, and they do Caribbean literature, primarily like kids and YA, but they also do adult titles as well. And actually late last year, after getting really tired of seeing like the same 5 YA titles on the Read Caribbean hashtag from like US publishers over and over, because like with the adult lit, there was such variety, but for YA it was just like these 5 books. I'm not going to name them. It's fine. I was like, you know what? I'm going to read my Blue Banyan books because I was always buying them, and I love them. I find that the writing from writers based and primarily living in the Caribbean, or maybe just being picked by someone in the Caribbean doing Caribbean publishing, feels so different to me than what comes out of the US space. So radically different, especially the YA. I've been trying to like really think about it and articulate why I feel this way. Like what am I seeing? How can I explain it or articulate it to others? But I've read most of their YA. I still have a few left, and I love all of them. My favorite is actually from a Indo-Caribbean writer called Imam Baksh, who did The Dark of the Sea. And it's basically this Lovecraftian influence book about this 15-year-old boy who has dyslexia and basically meets this mermaid called Medusa, or mer person. And it's fantastic. Like it's set entirely in Guyana. It was completely relatable to me and then also different. There was this mix of like Lovecraft and Hindu and Greek elements. And then also the ending kind of reminded me of like kaiju, like Godzilla type of like it was like the wildest mix. And I was like,
what's her name again? I'm sorry. What's her name, the author?
Imam Baksh. He's a man.
Oh, it's a man. Okay.
Yeah, dude. And The Dark of the Sea. And I was just like, first of all, seeing this in a Caribbean setting blew my mind. But also, I felt like it was this unique mix that I wouldn't necessarily be able to get elsewhere. And I find that I think that's probably what a lot of like the small publishers in like the Indian in US and Canada, and then out here in the Caribbean are able to do. Like if we say that we're seeing too much of one thing here or whatever, like we can go out there and actively look for other titles, and we are out there trying to push them. And that's what I've been trying to like encourage Caribbean readers who are in the region. Like, I know you have your small publishers out there. It may be hard for me to access. I don't even care if I can get access to the book. I just want to see you reading and talking about them in hearing about them. So yeah, like that book is, and he has another one, Children of the Spider. And my friend read it and she said, I think I prefer it over The Dark of the Sea. And I was like, what? I can't even imagine that right now. So I got it and I'm really excited to read it.
Sorry, I got excited, man. You don't know.
Yeah, trust me, it was so good, and it dealt with trauma too, because there is trigger warnings for like suicide and alcoholism, because I think both of those are an issue in the Caribbean, but I think in particular amongst Indo-Caribbean communities in Guyana and in Trinidad and Tobago. So like I have a friend and she's Indo-Caribbean Guyanese, and she said she read it and it was like her father's life almost. And she kind of read it and discussed it with her father all throughout. And they had so much fun with the book. And she felt like so proud, like to see someone write about like her space in this really honest and authentic and excellent way. And yeah, it made me happy. So that's me for The Dark of the Sea.
Thank you.
I love. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I know I said this was only going to be an hour on the agenda, so I want to be like, yeah, we're 40 minutes over and acknowledge that. So like, if we need to cut this short, we can. And also, Britt Reiterly had a question. She wanted to know if anyone had Black zombie book recs.
Unfortunately, no.
Zombies.
No, I don't read a lot of. I don't think I've ever read a book with a zombie in it.
Not a full length. So
No,
like,
I must have seen.
Come Let Us Sing Anyway has a story with one, but I'm trying to think of like a full length with zombies.
All I've ever seen is comics and short stories, and
This is not going to hit the mark, but it is a book that I want to read. The Girl with All the Gifts.
Oh yes, of course.
But it's not. I don't think it's a. I don't know who the author is.
It's not a Black author. It's a white author, but it's still worth reading.
Is the main character a Black girl in the book? Because I know it is in the movie.
In the book, I want to say it is. I want to say it is. From what I remember, it's been a while since I've encountered it.
I do want to read the book for research purposes, like even though it's not a Black author, just because of the centering. At least in the movie, the main character is a Black girl.
Yeah.
And I think that making the Black girl the main character changes the story. But I don't know if it was the author's intent or if it was the screenwriter. Is that what you call the person who writes the movie?
Yeah.
The movie writer's intent. So that's the only one that
she is canonically Black. He describes her as dark skin and black hair.
In the book?
In the novel, yeah. Okay,
so it's not own voices centering a Black character and zombies. Yeah, there's a they're not are they zombies? I mean,
essentially yes.
Okay.
They are infected by something similar to the cordyceps, which is the fungi that takes over various insects and stuff like that. I don't know if you ever played The Last of Us.
Gross, yeah.
And it's about children who are infected with this, but because they're so young, their DNA changes it. And so they're basically the next step of evolution because they are able to control that particular virus, though most of them go a little feral. But it's actually a really good book. It's actually one of my favorite books. I love that book. Right. I forget about it because they are zombies. I just don't think of them that way. I just think of them as like, like infected, like T-virus kind of thing. So I don't automatically think zombies. I think like, Walking Dead kind of stuff, which they go out of their way not to call them zombies, essentially. Yeah. So you don't automatically think, oh, that's zombies anymore.
If we're talking comics, there's The Wilds by Vida Ayala with art by Emily Pearson. It's about a Black queer woman who's basically in a zombie apocalypse. And her job is to like make runs for supplies for her compound. So that's a comic if people are into that. So I haven't read Zone 1 by Colson Whitehead, but I hear that there are zombies in that.
I'm just remembering it's actually on my shelf. Not Wild Seeds. It's a Black author. It is zombies. Who asked for it? Britt Reiterly?
Yep. Right.
Okay, I'll have to find it, but it's on my bookshelf. I can see it, but I can't find the name. But it is a zombie. There's a zombie, a scientist, in something else. I talked about it in one of my hauls, but I don't remember which one. But yeah, there's a zombie. There is one zombie that I know about. One zombie story.
I haven't read Dread Nation in a very long time.
Oh,
Is there-
yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah, she had said nation.
Oh, the expression.
Sorry.
So-
Sorry. If we're not looking for like zombies in the physical sense, there's Master of Poisons by Andrea Hairston. There's sort of a dream realm where this person is basically like enslaving people's souls, and they pretty much will like eat and consume people. They don't feel pain. It works very similar to zombies, but it's not like in the physical world. What else was there? I haven't read this one either, but I saw it around. Bloodthirsty Planet Dead by Sylvester Barzy. I think that's like a young adult. I don't know if anyone's heard of that one or has thoughts on that one.
I feel like I'm slipping on my zombie.
There isn't a lot. I made it a prompt, or we made it a prompt for the Black SF Epathon photo challenge, and everyone did Dread Nation. We were hoping for more zombie stories and not to have to do the work of looking for them, but no luck.
Whoops.
No dice.
It be like that. It be like that.
Harley, do you have something to say? Okay.
We can't hear anything you're saying, or
Oh,
I can't hear anything.
Sorry, I mute so that I don't disturb people and stuff. But I don't. That's the thing. It's like I don't particularly have a problem with the book. I just personally really did not like it. It felt. People are gonna come for me for this. It felt very reductive and very, very. It just felt like zombies and stuff, and it sounded like it should have been interesting, especially with the time period it was set in and everything, Civil War era and everything like that. But it just wasn't. It just felt very, very plain. And I think the problem with that is that I read a lot of adult genre fiction. And so adult genre fiction is very batshit, to put it in rank. So like whatever you do in YA, it's hard for me to like enjoy it. It'll end up seeming kind of basic to me when I put it alongside its actual genres. And so it was one of those books that was hyped to me as like, oh, this has not been done before. We're taking zombies to like the Civil War and stuff like that. I was like, okay, all right, let's go. And then I was like, I already read this though. And mind you, I don't say that just because there's a lot of times where I will read the same tropes over and over again if they're presented in a way that's, really cool. You mix it up, you do your own thing with it. There wasn't anything unique about it that I hadn't already come across, and that's why I couldn't enjoy it. It just felt like, it's slaves and zombies. That's weird. But that was just it. That was all it was. It was just zombies. I was like, okay. But I'm also the same person that didn't like the Pride and Prejudice and Zombies book, so there's that.
Well, I guess that's another zombie book. Counterpoint to Dread Nation. I enjoyed it, but I also did not appreciate the problems with the portrayal of Indigenous peoples the first time that I read it. And then when I watched Etu Brody,
yeah,
who I think they go by Bear now. I'm not sure.
Yeah, they're NB. Yeah.
No, but Bear, the name.
Bear, they changed their name.
I don't know, but I don't want to call them by their wrong name. But anyway, they taught me a lot about reading that book right. So I think that if you do take up Dread Nation, that's a lens through which you should be reading the book if you are reading it, because there obviously is a conversation that needs to happen between Black folks and Indigenous folks on Turtle Island and the way that we represent the land during those historical periods, which is the point that you made earlier, Bree.
I I tried to watch the video, but they had privated it, I think.
Yes.
Because of the backlash. Do you know if I'll go see if they made it public again?
I don't know that they have, but I think that like
Probably not.
I think that the view might be widespread enough that even in the absence of that particular video, there might be other
critiques,
or even if you just read with that in mind.
Oh, I don't want to read it, but I
just
wanted to.
Read it.
No, sorry.
Don't mistake me for someone who wants to read that.
I'm sorry. I didn't.
That's what that sounded like.
It sounds like, look, I'm never reading it. I'm not. No.
This is for the benefit of other people.
I came out harsher than I meant. I just. Yeah. I would be interested in critiques of the book from that angle. So I will go and look elsewhere because I do remember them being the person who, like, it was their critique that I remember being the one that really kind of lit the fire on that perspective.
Yeah,
but I'll look elsewhere.
Took it down. I'm not seeing it.
Yeah,
that makes me sad because I had already read the book by the time I watched that, and like I tried to figure out why a lot of it rubbed me wrong.
The book?
Yeah. A lot of the portrayal of the Native Americans rubbed me wrong. And I couldn't quite grasp it. And like having him explain some of the things and then further having me to go look at the research on it. And he says, I will admit there is historically a lot of bad blood between Native Americans and Black people that people don't talk about. And so I can imagine that because we don't talk, we tend to represent each other poorly in our narratives. And I think that I feel like a lot of that is missed opportunity as well, since there was a lot of like raw on both sides of the fence.
Yeah. And it's also like how it was that was constructed, right? Like that animosity was by design. And I feel like I've also come across, and I can't put my finger on it, but even in some of Octavia Butler's work, and I'm an Octavia Butler stan, like it's almost
okay to say it.
It's almost religious. And sorry?
I said you gotta live your life.
You know, sometimes it be like that, which is a Breeism. I said that the other day. Somebody was saying something, and I was like, sometimes it'd be like that. It'd be like that. Bree says that. That's not a Nigerianism. But you know, it's interesting because sometimes, because I read almost exclusively Black writers and science fiction and fantasy, there's certain things I don't encounter as much as people who read more broadly. So, but when they show up in in SFF, I notice because I'm just like, ooh, that's something. And a lot of the work, like there aren't enough writers who are turning their attention to how they portray Indigenous communities in their imaginings of the future. And so like that's a piece. And I don't think that you can deal with Black trauma in literature well without really exploring the interconnection between, like, what does it mean to have been brought over here, enslaved on land that was stolen and forced into a relationship, right? What does that actually mean? And that's a dialogue. Like even books before I started reading more science fiction and fantasy, when I was reading books written by Caribbean authors about the Caribbean, the way that indigenous populations in the Caribbean were being portrayed was also quite problematic too at that time, right? So I think that's also an area, like, how does our trauma interact with others? And in the process of writing to heal through trauma, are we contributing to the trauma of others, or are we seeing our liberation intertwined with their own, right? Which is that quote by the Australian Aboriginal woman, Linda, I forget her last name, right? Yeah, so that's something that's occupying a lot of my mind as well. I'm curious, Britt. I'm curious about people who like zombie stories too. Like, what is it about zombies? Is it zombies as a metaphor for something? Because I've read a lot about people who see zombieism as a metaphor for various forms of, like, oppression, or if it's the aesthetic of it. I'm curious about that.
I wanted to piggyback on what you said because I was like screaming, like just really excited. In addition to being a therapist, I'm also an educator, and I don't want to say exclusively, primarily work with Indigenous and Black and African identifying students, and I make it a point to constantly create spaces for those intersectional conversations to be had. So that's just something I really enjoy being a part of.
Same.
For a book where I'm not going to say it's necessarily dealing with it well because I can't speak to it, but I know that the writer did work with a Crow Nation writer as well to write those elements of the book and those characters. It's not speculative though; it's historical fiction called Book of the Little Axe by Lauren Francis Sharma. And a lot of it follows a Black Trinidadian woman and her life in Trinidad, and then moving to what was still Crow Nation land, and intermarrying there and having a mixed son. And I found it really unusual. I hadn't really come across a lot of stories that dealt with Black and Indigenous life in what we now know as the US. And I do know in interviews, she said she really made a point of really doing her best to get it right and working with someone who could read the material, because she knew what it felt like to see someone else try to write her culture and it just be, utter garbage. So that's a book I can recommend as another writer who is at least going in with that lens, as opposed to being oblivious and it kind of coming up in ways that are like not great. And for poetry, there's Olive Senior, and she always engages a lot with stories and mythologies in her work as a part of what is Jamaican story and what is Jamaican history. And she is rare as well, in my opinion, in terms of of her approach and how she does that, because typically we don't really, they're just, Taino are just seen as a footnote of history in terms of how Jamaica talks about them. Oh, they were here and then they died, and oh, they were a lot of colonialist claptrap. So it was really wonderful to see an author actively engage and unearth and do the work that, I think is needed, because that is a part, like, those are the people who lived here. And their descendants are still here. So
I do have a question actually about that. And this piggybacks off of outside of the book community, but more so in the real world, when the discussion about Black History Month coming up. There are other heritage months that we do know of that have been around for ages, of course, just like Black History Month. Do you guys think that you feel some form of obligation to celebrate those months as well as Black History Month? I know that I do. I try to educate myself when they come around very often as well, like, because just like May is American Asian History Month, and there is a Native American one as well. I was just wondering, it's like, do y'all feel the obligation to be a part of that? And should we also be pushing those months as well in a form of like solidarity as marginalized people?
I personally think that we should be expanding our reading gaze year round.
Yes.
I do recognize with myself, I have a little bit of uncomfortable, like discomfort, I should say, with just putting a culture or a group in a month, because people are, culture X or race X the other 11 months of the year. So I try to incorporate that throughout the year. But I also think that visibility is very much important, and some races and ethnicities have more access to visibility than others. And I think it's important that we show solidarity for our other like brothers and sisters. But I do have some discomfort with being like, let's only do it for a month. Not that you're
Oh
saying
no.
all,
Yeah, no.
like you didn't say that at all. But I always find that to be the narrative. Like for Black History Month, I saw like white booktubers, or not white book, maybe white booktubers too. I wasn't really looking.
It was
But,
mostly white booktubers.
white bookstagrammers being like, let's put our stack of Black books. And I'm like, are we only doing this for February? So I don't know. I just think it should be a continuous thing.
I think that, which is why I say that I think there's, like, for me, which is what I'm planning to do, I think there should be a solidarity in promoting visibility as far as that goes, because, mind you, like I said, broadly read, I read everything from translated works to stuff that's published here, but I know not everyone's like me, so they maybe don't know that these things exist. So I want to have those times where I can centralize on certain cultures and stuff and put the focus on them and highlight them. I'm going to always do it year round, but I wonder if like it would be more helpful instead of waiting for, I guess you say, white people or the quote unquote general audience to do it. And we just do it ourselves and just basically take them out of the narrative, take them out as like a driving force behind it, because they don't really need to be. If we're together, we make up just as much as they do. So I just wondered if it was something that like felt like, would it be something that would be good to start doing that sort of thing, like start focusing on those certain types of like reads and visibility and stuff during those months, and like, yes, pepper them throughout the year, but give more of a focus to them, basically, equal,
As a Jamaican, I mean, I don't really celebrate any of those months. So
I mean, fair.
no, I know. So
Fair.
I just like, so for me, it's Black History Month has kind of gotten like a popularity, I think, in Jamaica anyway, and it coincides with our Reggae Month. And so, like, if you follow Rebel Woman Lit, you would have seen, like, all throughout February, like, the way that they were sort of connecting the two and highlighting writers that obviously intersect and cover both. But for my part, I don't know if I orient so much around the months. I think for me, it's more like the reading challenges on Bookstagram. And often, like, they will coincide with the month sometimes. So like it works, and it works. But I tend to, like, for example, like with Read the World 21, they're doing Korean literature this month. And then there's Erin and Dan's book club, and they're both Indigenous readers, and they're doing, I think, Indigenous memoirs this year. And so I think that's how I more orient myself as opposed to the months. Like, I know I want to focus. It's part of what I love about Bookstagram, because there's such an international community. So I tend to focus on like those readers that, like, the Singaporean readers and what are they reading and so on. And they tend to have their own challenges. And then I'll like jump in and I'll post about them too. So, and reshare. And so that brings the focus there. So that's more how I guess the ecosystem works for me on Bookstagram.
That makes me kind of want to join Bookstagram, honestly. I have like a light foot in there, but because I'm mostly on Twitter, that's where most of the coverage I can get on there is. And most of the pressure is very, very angry on there. It's like,
it's true. I'm on Twitter too. Yeah, I see it.
Yeah, if you're not reading this, you're this. If you don't read this, you're this. If you don't give equal coverage to this and this, then I'm not doing anything for you. And I'm just like, it's like I just want to give some visibility. That's all I want to do.
I appreciate that.
There is a lot of pressure on there. That actually does go back to the Ellen McKinney thing. I feel like there's a lot of pressure, especially since her main platform is Twitter. So it's like everyone on there is so angry. So angry all the time. But somebody brought up a really good point that I actually wanted to make when I got around to it again. I was trying to say it and I couldn't figure out a way to like say it in a sentence, but it's like they said, Black are of many heritages, so we should want to support as many different heritages as possible because there's a lot of us who are mixed as well, like biracial and stuff. Like me, Haitian and Native American, Blackfoot specifically. And then you have some people who are Blasian, you have some people who are Afro-Latino, things like that. And like half Black and half Mexican or of Mexican descent, things like that. And I thought it would be something that would be nice for us to step into those other heritages too, because a lot of us aren't just of this particular heritage. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a good thing on there. I saw it and I was like, yes, he said the thing I was trying to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna call time because I know I told you guys it was only gonna be an hour and we're done that. And I apologize because that required more active moderation, which I did not do, so apologies. But Britt had a comment and Jerry, and then I'm going to sign us off. Britt said, I'm interested in the zombie as a revolutionary figure, particularly considering its Haitian origins and its parallels to the captive body.
Right, yeah, that's what I was thinking. Great answer. Yeah, I don't read zombie lit, but I've seen a lot of articles written about like the particular Haitian take on it and what it means in relation. Yeah, cool, nice.
Thank you.
In terms of signing us off, I think I kind of want to like think and synthesize about what we've been talking about because there's a lot of different things and the conversation went in a lot of good different ways. And I think we talked about some important takeaways for me was the denial phase when we're talking about trauma, the importance of healing from trauma being an intergenerational, multi-person effort. And what that looks like personally, and also what that looks like in terms of the books we're reading and gatekeeping and publishing and all the multi-layer tiers there. I think we talked about how trauma is very different for different people and how the universalizing of certain experiences can be a trauma of itself. The brushing away of certain experiences can be a trauma of itself. And also talking about how reading can be healing, and how reading can be healing, and certain writers, how they discuss trauma can feel generative and healing and energizing in some ways. I think that was everything. Oh, and I guess also thinking about history and how historical traumas manifest across different groups, and I guess being less insular. So those are all great things to think about. Thank you everyone for bringing your perspectives and your expertise. Goodbye and have a good rest of your Saturday.
Thank you, Chloe.
Thank you very much for having
us.